It's quite a contrast to a talk I gave a couple of years ago in the UK when I was speaking at a drafty village hall in the north of England, and the chairman began his introduction of me by haranguing the audience. And he said to them, "Look, if more of you don't come to these meetings, we're never going to get a decent speaker." Well, I can't resist taking up your comments about the forthcoming London Olympic Games. And it's a subject that's quite close to my heart because just about 10 days ago we had our British Olympic and Sports Minister here for an event in Melbourne. And it was very interesting. He was in the very fortunate position of being able to say that we are bringing in these Olympics not just ahead of time but under budget, which is pretty exceptional in major public infrastructure projects. But of course he went on to say that one of the reasons for that is because we've had so many Australians involved in the project and we've drawn very heavily on the experience from Sydney. He also undertook a small wager with Kate Lundy, your local senator, and they agreed that I should say when Britain gets more gold medals than Australia, Kate is going to row the Olympic course in west of London in a place called Eton Dorney, wearing the British uniform. And should, by some unforeseen circumstance, Australia get more gold medals than the UK, then our minister is going to dress in the yellow and gold and run around Australia House in the Strand. So we're looking forward to that later on in the year. Well, let me first set out what I'm going to cover this morning. First of all, I'm going to talk about some of the drivers of national security, the factors which underlay decisions that get made. Then I'm going to describe some of the major players in the UK context. I'll talk about our national security strategy and the Strategic Defence and Security Review which flowed from it. I'll talk about some major current areas of activity in which we're engaged. Then I'll focus a little bit on some of the security risks we see for the UK in Asia. And finally, I'll talk about our very close partnership with Australia. And then afterwards, I'll be very happy to take any questions. So first of all, what are the drivers which influence national security policies and national security priorities in any country? I suppose the most important is protecting the homeland. We don't history, so we're in a fairly unusually benign period. But of course, we do face threats in fields like terrorism, in cyber, and areas, less traditional areas like climate change. Another driver of national security would be the institutional framework, so the various international groupings of which we're a member, which bring with them responsibilities. Key ones for Britain would be being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, our membership of NATO, and our membership of the European Union. And of course many other bodies too, including the Commonwealth, but I'm focused particularly on security today. Another important driver of our security interests would be our history. And for the UK, that includes things like our overseas territories, which you might describe as a residue of the imperial period. So these would be places that are left over from the decolonization period because they were too small to be independent territories in their own right, so they retain a residual relationship with the UK. You can think of places like the Falklands. You can think about our role in the sovereign base areas in Cyprus, which again comes from our history. Geography is also important. So when the European countries responded to the conflict in the Balkans, they did that because it was in their neighborhood. It was something happening on their borders. Economic interests are also important drivers. We have a keen interest in protecting our commercial interests, protecting our access to supplies of important commodities and resources, and protecting the trade routes by which we prosper and flourish. But the other way the economy influences our national security is because the strength of a country's economy determines how active that country can be from a security perspective. So if we look at the big growth which has taken place in China's defense capabilities over recent times, it's not just because that's what its leaders have decided, it's because there has been an enormous growth of its economy which has enabled it to make those investments. A further driver of our security policies would be our values. Britain shares with Australia values around the rule of law, democracy, freedom of speech, tolerance, human rights. And sometimes that can lead to interesting judgments about how we balance, for example, the need, in order to protect our security, to work with countries who don't always share all of those values to the same extent. A further factor in our security background would be the diaspora communities, which we have in the UK, and we have many, as you can imagine. I think, reverting to the Olympics, one of our proud boasts is that none of the 200 teams at the Olympics will be without a local support base from their communities already in the UK. And I'll talk about some of those communities in a bit more detail later on. And then finally, public opinion and the media. This is something that all governments have to take heed of, and in the UK, civil society is very active. So let me turn now to talk about some of the major players in the UK context. And at the centre of the web, of course, is the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister now serviced by the National Security Council, which he chairs. This is a new institution in the UK, which was set up following the arrival of the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government in 2010. It includes the key ministers, the chiefs of the military and the intelligence agencies. It meets every week, and it's a powerful structure right at the heart of government. Its aim is to give clear direction, and one of its first important tasks was to oversee the development of our national security strategy. It also created the role of National Security Advisor as the principal source of advice to the Prime Minister on security and intelligence issues, and the heads of the intelligence agencies report to this National Security Advisor. Then there are a whole range of government departments engaged in this, and the principal ones would of course be the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Home Office, but also others too. Other major players include, of course, the military, headed by the Chief of the Defence Staff, who also has direct access to the Prime Minister. We have a number of agencies, the Security Service, the Secret Intelligence Service, GCHQ, and the intelligence assessments which they produce are coordinated by the JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee, which now reports to the NSA in our new framework. Parliament has an important role, of course. In the UK, the Prime Minister has the prerogative to commit military forces overseas without prior approval of Parliament. Indeed, I believe that we entered the Second World War in 1939 without a prior parliamentary vote. But of course, it's important that Prime Ministers and governments carry Parliament with them. So, for example, in our decisions to take action in Afghanistan and Iraq, Tony Blair did ensure the support of Parliament in advance. There are also a series of relevant oversight committees. On day-to-day business, the key parliamentary oversight bodies are the Commons Select Committee on Defence and the Commons Select Committee on Foreign Affairs. But there is also a joint committee of the Commons and the Lords on intelligence and security, and they're appointed directly by the Prime Minister and are usually made up of senior backbenchers, usually with extensive ministerial experience. NGOs can also be important players, and the UK is home to some of the major international NGOs, for example, Amnesty International, and they're also significant players and a significant voice in many debates. And the media are important too, and for us particularly the BBC, both because of its global coverage and its very widespread brand recognition. And so the media can have a significant influence on public opinion and thus on the politicians. So let me turn now to talk a bit more about our national security strategy, which was released in October 2010, about 6 months after the government had taken office. It identifies the risks, it aims to set clear priorities, it then looks at the capabilities that we need to address those risks and the resources that we have to allocate in order to provide those capabilities. And I think it's put particular emphasis on spotting the emerging risks. It also focused on the need for a closer relationship between the government, the private sector, and the public in addressing some of these risks. The fact that it isn't just a matter for governments. And it led to a number of decisions on our armed forces, which I'll talk about in a moment. So it defined the goal as, quote, a prosperous, secure, modern, and outward-looking nation, confident in its values and ideas. Its main tenets, therefore, were prosperity, security, and freedom. And for that, it suggested that we require domestic resilience at home and global stability abroad. It tried to analyze the changing world, the way in which some of the pressures that we face are evolving. For example, the relative economic weight within the world is clearly shifting eastwards towards Asia and to other emerging economies. It's a world which is increasingly multipolar. And it's a world which is also more interconnected and interdependent. And we only need to look at the impact of the global financial crisis to realize just how interdependent we all are today. It's a world where scientific and technological innovation continues apace, where we face the environmental impacts of climate change and the need to respond to those. And it concluded overall that risks are becoming much more diverse, whereas in the past we might have focused on one or two key threats. There's now no one overriding threat as there would have been, for example, during the Cold War. The National Security Strategy also looked at Britain's role and position in the world. We are the 6th largest economy in the world. London is a major world hub for many things, from finance to media. The English language is an important network that we're part of. It gives us a web of international relationships. Britain is a country that's very open to the world. And so that leads us to two major objectives: to ensure that in the UK we're secure and resilient, and to help shape a stable world in which we can all prosper and flourish. Well, we realize that we can't always prevent risks, so it's very important to promote resilience. And so we conducted a National Security Risk Assessment, an NRSA, and this looked at two time horizons, the 5-year and the 20-year. And it was essentially a matrix which looked at both the likelihood of something happening and also the relative impact if it did happen. And from that matrix, it identified 15 generic risks, and it categorized those into 3 different tiers. So the first tier, or the top priority, and I'll expand on these in a moment, included international terrorism, both CBRN and some residual Northern Ireland, cyber attacks and cybercrime, a major accident or a natural hazard, for example, coastal flood, an international crisis between states where we get drawn in. Tier 2, an attack on the UK or its overseas territories by state or proxy using CBRN, major instability or civil war overseas which allow terrorists to threaten the UK, significant increases in organized crime, and disruption to satellite communications. And then the third tier, large-scale conventional attack on the UK by another state. Now, of course, if that were to happen, it would be a very serious matter indeed. The fact it's in Tier 3 reflects the likelihood of happening, as I said, and it's not just the impact of it happening. Other elements in Tier 3 would be a significant increase in terrorists, criminals, or illegal migrants crossing our border, disruption to our oil and gas supplies caused by war or accident, a major nuclear release from a UK civil site, conventional state attack on another NATO member, an attack on a UK overseas territory, for example, due to sovereignty conflict, disruption of supplies of food and minerals, and so on. So the highest priority is tackling the Tier 1 risks, and I'm going to look at those in a little more detail. So the first of these was terrorism, where, of course, the major threat is Al-Qaeda, not just in the Afghanistan-Pakistan borders, but also in places like Somalia, the Yemen, Iraq. And these groups may develop CBRN capabilities. Also, there is the problem of lone terrorists, people who self-radicalize perhaps through access to the internet. And we have some residual groups in Northern Ireland, very small now because of the significant progress which has happened since the Good Friday agreements. Cyber is a big concern. Governments, businesses, individuals are being attacked every day. And this can impact on our critical infrastructure. We can suffer from cybercrime, and we see terrorists increasingly using the internet. International military crises can also be in Tier 1. We try to avoid threats to the UK, for example, by our NATO membership and ultimately by our nuclear deterrent. But in recent years, we've seen action in the Balkans, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, because we judged in our national interests that we were threatened and needed to take that action. Problems in failing states can sometimes trigger crises, and we also see growing regional power struggles around the world. Another Tier 1 risk would be major accident or hazard. The UK tends to suffer less extreme events than many other countries. Things like earthquakes, for example, don't tend to occur in the UK, and I've been very conscious of that living in Australia for about a year when there seems to be a flood or a bushfire at any one moment. But, for example, an influenza pandemic could have massive impact in the UK, where our population is so densely clustered. In 1919, 250,000 Brits died from the Spanish influenza. And the UK is also potentially vulnerable to coastal flooding, particularly in the east, as the UK landmass is tilting eastward. And it wouldn't need to be on a huge geographical scale to have a massive impact in the UK, because so much of our population is clustered in major cities there. So all of this risk analysis has implications for the capabilities and resources that we need. And the fact that something is identified as the highest risk doesn't necessarily mean that it attracts the most resources. In part, it depends on how well we are already prepared to address those particular risks. And some capabilities may be very much more costly than others. We may need to devote resources to events which have a low risk, but a very severe impact. And so that's the reason for our nuclear deterrence, which is, of course, very expensive. So our main priorities for resources and capabilities which flowed from this strategic review were to protect our operational counter-terrorist capabilities in the fields of intelligence, in the fields of police. We launched major new programs in cyber security. We wanted to develop a cross-government effort on natural hazards, and in addressing natural hazards, building resilience both in the business and in the private citizen capacities. And we want to use the diplomacy, intelligence, and defense capabilities at our disposal to prevent the threat of international military crises. And the British government has committed to produce a new national security strategy and a strategic defense and security review every 5 years going forward. So at the same time as we published the National Security Strategy in October 2010, the government also produced its Strategic Defence and Security Review, or the SDSR. A big part of the background was the fact that there was significant pressure on public spending, but also we needed to align our capabilities with the current assessment of the national security risks. We wanted to ensure that we were focused on the challenges of the future and not the challenges of the Cold War. So we are going to be cutting defence, but by less than other government departments. As you know, the UK is going through an exercise to reduce government spending in order to get our deficit under control. So the budget for defence will still rise in cash terms. We will meet the NATO target of 2% of GDP, and will continue to be the fourth largest military budget in the world. The review identified 7 military tasks: defending the UK and its overseas territories, providing strategic intelligence, providing nuclear deterrence, supporting civil emergency organisations in times of crisis, defending our interests by projecting power strategically through expeditionary interventions, providing a defence contribution to UK influence, and providing security for stabilisation. And from this review flowed an assessment of the future force structure, which we identified as necessary for the 2020s, with three broad elements: a deployed force, a high readiness force, and a lower readiness force. So just to look at what this means for each of the individual services. For the Navy, the future force will include Trident, with the nuclear deterrent, 7 Astute-class nuclear hunter-killer subs, a carrier strike based around a single new operational carrier and a second one at extended readiness, a surface fleet of 19 frigates and destroyers, and the Royal Marines. For land, we'll have 5 multi-role assault brigades with 6,500 personnel, air assault brigade, the Paras, plus their weapon systems. One of the bonuses from the ending of the Cold War is that we're able to reduce by about 40% of our tanks and 35% of our artillery. And by 2020, we will have withdrawn all of our forces from Germany. And that's significant when you think we currently have 20,000 service personnel and families still based in Germany. For the Air Force, we will have a fast jet fleet of Typhoon and Joint Strike Fighters, tactical airlift, 12 new Chinook helicopters. We will retain the Tornadoes in a transitional period, but we withdrew the Harrier last year. What does that mean in personnel terms? Well, by 2015, we will have reduced the Navy by 5,000 to 30,000, the Army by 7,000 to 95,000, and the Air Force by 5,000 to 33,000. The Army will reduce further to 82,000, but we're going to make up the frontline strength through increased dependence on a reserve force of around 30,000. And this signals a significant increase in the role of reserve forces for the UK, and it's an area that we're very interested to talk to Australia about, because you have traditionally made a greater use of reserve forces. There will also be a major transformation of our cyber capabilities with the establishment of a Defence Cyber Operations Group and significant new funding going into this. But within all of these new projections, we've prioritised our current operations in Afghanistan. We have over 9,000 military currently serving in the UN-mandated, NATO-led mission. And in line with Australia and with other partners, we will have reduced our forces considerably and will no longer be in a combat role by the end of 2014, as the Afghan National Security Forces are progressively able to take on responsibility themselves. Let me talk now about some of our important current areas of activity around the world. I mentioned Afghanistan, Pakistan. This is the main source of domestic CT concerns for the UK, although we're also worried about terrorism originating elsewhere, in East Africa, in Nigeria, and the Yemen. And the main purpose of the Allied intervention in Afghanistan was to ensure that it can never again be used as a base for terrorism against our homelands. Pakistan is a major UK preoccupation. We have a diaspora of around 1.2 million citizens of Pakistani origin in the UK. So it's very important to us that we have a deep, long-term strategic relationship with Pakistan. Iran is back at the top of everyone's agenda. Iran has spent years defying the UN Security Council and the IAEA while pressing on with its nuclear program. We want to find a negotiated outcome with Iran, but so far there's no sign that they're serious about engaging in it. The UK withdrew our diplomatic presence in Tehran last year after our embassy was attacked. Somalia, the problems in that region, and particularly piracy. Prime Minister Cameron recently hosted a conference in London on piracy in Somalia, well, on Somalia in general. This produced agreement on closer cooperation to combat piracy and terrorism in Somalia, to meet Somalia's development and humanitarian needs, to support an enlarged AMISOM, and to ensure a transition to a more representative government after the end of the current UN mandate in August. Cyber is another current priority, and this is a very broad topic, because we're not just talking about state on state. We're also talking about cybercrime, identity theft, threats to critical national infrastructure. Now, Foreign Secretary William Hague hosted a big cyber conference in London last November, and that conference started to sketch out an agenda for a coordinated approach with the Allies to get global agreement on behaviours and norms in cyberspace, and also how to tackle state actors who carry out unacceptable levels of attacks. So how do we perceive some of the risks in Asia? Well, I guess our perspective of the risks in the Asian region would be very similar to Australia's. We see massive and growing trade and investment interest in the region, obvious for you, but also for us too. We see a number of potential flashpoints, the DPRK, Taiwan, disputes in the South China Sea. And so we welcome the emerging institutional frameworks in the Asia-Pacific region, which should enable a smooth and peaceful rise for emerging countries, including China. The EU is engaged in the region through the ASEM process and the ARF processes, but we're not party to the East Asia Summit groupings. And in the absence of developed defence fora in the region, we've participated regularly at ministerial level in the Shangri-La dialogues in Singapore. So let me turn finally to our partnerships with Australia. These are, of course, based on very strong historic ties, on shared military experience in world wars, but they also remain vital and relevant in the current day. We have a whole series of bilateral defence agreements which cover personnel exchanges, equipment cooperation, science and technology. And we have currently under negotiation a defence cooperation treaty which is going to flow from the Auckland process. We have an incredibly close intelligence relationship under the Five Eyes intelligence partnership. And that means that our policymakers are making their decisions on the basis of a common analysis and shared understandings, which is very important. We've seen cooperation in recent military operations in Iraq and currently in Afghanistan. We are fellow members of the FPDA, the Five Powers Defence Arrangements, which is slightly a quirk of history, but is something that's unique in the regional defence and security architecture. It binds the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore and Malaysia. It consists of a small permanent planning team in Penang in Malaysia and annual exercises. Defence procurement is another important area of cooperation because for all of us, as programmes get bigger and our budgets get more stretched, it's more important than ever that we cooperate internationally. And there are lots of opportunities to do more with Australia in this field. The British company, BAE Systems, is already the largest defence company in Australia and a very major investor in the Australian economy. Increasingly, our defence ministries are looking at working even more closely together right at the early stages of initiating and planning requirements. And finally, the AUKMIN, the Australia-UK ministerial meetings. These bring together foreign and defence ministers and their officials, military and intelligence chiefs. These meetings had been taking place for a number of years, but had become somewhat sporadic, so they were reinvigorated in January 2011 under the current government. And they further strengthened the already close relations between ministers and their officials. For example, my own Foreign Minister, William Hague, got into the habit of speaking very regularly to Kevin Rudd, and he was the first Foreign Minister to speak to Bob Carr when he was appointed as your Foreign Minister. And so I think this is a relationship, a personal relationship, which will continue to be very strong. Well, thank you. That's a summary of the structures in the UK, some of our priorities, how we're operating and how we're working together with Australia.